Good evening. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. It's so good to see all of you here for the second series of presentations on mortality as medicine. My gift tonight is to introduce to you Karen McGee. And Karen, many of you know, is a friend and parishioner, and this is really her brainchild. So we have her to thank for envisioning this. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you, and thank you, David. I first want to do a special thank you to David Ware. Need my glasses. Might help. To David Ware, I'm so grateful for your language, your stories, and your willingness to entertain the big questions of this world. That you don't provide answers, but ask questions for and of us, suggest we go deeper, and in many cases go with us, is testament to your excellence as teacher and mentor. So thank you. Okay, and now on to another great teacher, David Keplinger. As many of you know, I came to poetry through grief. In the first poetry class I took in the midst of the pandemic, I was introduced to the beautiful human being and amazing poet Rosemary Watola Tromer, who's written and shared a poem a day for 15 years. She and her writer friend Christy Ashwanden host a podcast on creative process, on which they interview other artists about the issues and questions that plague creative people. About a year and a half ago, I tuned into the podcast, and David was on to discuss his new book, Ice, which was created out of a fascination he developed around ice age animals that had been completely preserved by permafrost for up to 50,000 years, and were now being uncovered because of the melting caused by the climate crisis. And then realized the animals were metaphorically speaking to layers of bodies under the ice in him that were asking to speak. This felt like the inward excavation of buried emotions I was trying to unearth in me to heal, and is what accepting our mortality invites us to do in order to figure out what parts of us we need to let die in order to live more fully while we are here. I also connected with his understanding of poetry as light, and as he said on the podcast, with light comes heat, and with heat comes the melting away of those frozen parts. So I bought the book, which is beautiful, and is on sale here, and then I saw him read in person a few months later at Bird in Hand Bookshop, and while there, learned about his weekly Zoom poetry meditation from a woman sitting at my table. I have attended most Fridays since then and have found them to be a refuge in the midst of the chaos of this world. He is an extraordinary teacher and is a kind and generous human being. And his official bio, he's a professor of literature and director of creative writing at American University in DC. He is the author of 8 collections of poetry and 6 volumes of literary translations from the Danish and the German, done in collaboration with authors from those languages. His work has won awards, including the Colorado Book Award, the Rilke Prize, the Emily Dickinson Award, and his first book won the T.S. Eliot Award, selected by Mary Oliver. So, welcome, David.
Everybody here? Okay, that works. Oh. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Karen, for that beautiful introduction. It's rare when you are invited as a speaker to actually have someone speak about you and not just read, what's out there that describes you. But it's been a pleasure getting to know you through these meditations. And coming here tonight, I was thinking about how I could bring together my 20-year friendship with Mary Oliver and the 20-year serious practice of writing poetry that emerged out of my knowing her and just observing how she was in the world as a reflection, as a perfect mirror to what many of you already know of her in her poems. Because her life really was a perfect mirror to what she described life to be in all of that work that we have of hers. And this is just a spare selection of what's out there. But I brought this book called Devotions, and I wanted to begin with one of her poems because in it comes a line that I use as the title for this talk as a part of the Mortality as Medicine series. And the poem is In Blackwater Woods. In Blackwater Woods. So I'm gonna read it slowly, and then I'm gonna read it a second time because sometimes it's hard to get a poem the first time through. So the first time, just float and listen to the language or any image that might come to you and stick. And the second time, hear it again when it returns and see what happens there. In Blackwater Woods, look. The trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the pond. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this: the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what's mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. So now you've heard it. Many of you have read this poem numerous times. It's one of the great poems in her entire epic career, along with Wild Geese, a poem that I'm sure some of you know as well. But for those of you who've never heard a Mary Oliver poem before or know nothing about this poet, I hope that tonight might offer a little introduction to the wonder behind her eyes. So here it is one more time. In Blackwater Woods, look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this: the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what's mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and then, when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. So much is happening in this poem from a poet's point of view, from somebody who practices poetry every day in some small way. I tell my students, I've said the word poetry every day for about 40 years. And that's something that gets you somewhere. There's just that practice alone. Say poetry every day for 40 years and you'll get somewhere. So from somebody's point of view like mine that does this every day, you just see the mastery happening on the page. You can even hear it when I'm only reading it, and you can't see the poem with its line breaks and all of its formal constructions. But there are three things in this poem that happen that I think are essential to understanding the work of Mary Oliver in the way that she does love what's mortal and holds it to her bones and then lets it go. The first is the first word of the poem, look. Attention is the beginning of devotion, she says. Really think about that. Attention is the beginning of devotion. So the things that we pay attention to take on an extra glow in our lives. Sometimes they're the negative things. We pay attention to the bad thing that happened this morning, or we pay attention to the noticeable flaws in our coworkers. We pay attention to the ways that someone cut us and hurt us. And those things also do take on a kind of glow. There's a negativity bias that is very much a part of Homo sapien consciousness. But the other side of attention is this, which is the devotional side. To pay attention to something is, for Mary Oliver, and I think for poets in general, another way of saying an act of love. That attention in her work is a small act of love. To just look at a thing and see beyond what the past has shown you into what the present is shining back to you. So that's the first thing, looking, deep looking. The second thing comes about halfway through the poem when she says, every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. You can't see it, but the line break on this stanza does a really interesting thing. No matter what its name is, that's where she breaks the line. So we have this little word is hanging there at the end of the stanza until we get to the next stanza that finishes the sentence, nameless now. So for me, as a poet, that's a huge move. That's a really loud kind of like scream of a move in the poem, because that line unto itself means something. All by itself, the line is, name is. So what she's saying is that no matter what we call these ponds, no matter what we call these different parts of nature, all of these dappled things around us, there is one name that they all share, and that name is. That comes out of the cloud of unknowing. If any of you do practice centering prayer, there's a beautiful passage in the cloud of unknowing written by an anonymous English monk in the 14th century, and it goes something like, for all the names that we call God, there is only one that comes even close, and that word is. So the isness of everything is the name that each thing shares. And you really see it in the work of this poet, who was briefly an Episcopalian, but otherwise didn't, yes, so otherwise did not affiliate herself with any church. But in the early thousands, in a book called Thirst, she writes a series of poems that are affiliated with her belonging to the Episcopalian church, and thanks to a good friend who took her under his wing and brought her to services for a while. But she has this spiritual quality to her poems that is undeniable, and it's right there in that word. The third thing is to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and then when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. The third is letting go. So it's this three-part system. Look. What is here? Stare deeply into it. Pay attention. Extend that love that attention can offer, and then let it go, which is exactly what we do in meditation. I run, as Karen said, I run meditations on Fridays. I use a poem to extract from the piece some small bit of instruction for the half an hour that we sit together. And the meditations do move like that. We pay attention to thoughts and we let them pass. We pay attention to emotions or feelings in the body, discomforts or worries that might cross our mental sky, and we let them pass. So there is something very practiced about what this poem is teaching us. And I guess I just want to say it's a famous poem. It's a great poem, and there are reasons why. When I started writing poems myself, I did not know why one poem by Robert Frost was considered great and another by an unknown poet was not. But over the years, studying this kind of work carefully, I've come to see that there are small moves like in that piece where you can really trace it back to its greatness. So Mary came into my life in 1999. I was 6 years out of graduate school. I had a series of jobs leading up to being an adjunct at 3 different schools in the Philadelphia area. So I was teaching college 6 courses a semester to over 100 people, trying to keep track of all of these papers and all of the driving around to these different areas around the Philadelphia area. And it was a lot. And I was just about ready to give up. In fact, I had just applied to law school. And after all these years, I was 29, and I was ready to throw in the towel. And right after New Year's, 1999, I got a call from Missouri, a woman named Nancy who represented a press whose contest I had entered. And Nancy said, "Well, we have good news for you. You've won the T.S. Eliot Prize." And so I thought, wow, this is incredible, the T.S. Eliot Prize. I can put that next to my name and I'm good. And she said, and there's really wonderful news that goes along with that. Mary Oliver was the judge. And I remember thinking to myself, the T.S. Eliot Prize, T.S. Eliot's name. And then I thought, and whoever this is, Mary Oliver, this poor person who's also named Mary Oliver, because I couldn't believe that the Mary Oliver was the judge for this little prize in Missouri. I was sure that it was another person named Mary Oliver. And Nancy said, no, it's the Mary Oliver, not a Mary Oliver. And I fell back in my chair. I was just stunned by this. So in that moment, those 2 names now associated with my little poems, it was incredible. And I was so happy, I asked if I could write Mary and thank her. And Nancy said, of course, just send us the letter and we'll forward it on to her. She was teaching at Bennington at the time. And lo and behold, I got a letter back from Mary. And she was very kind and very sweet about my poems, which were mixed. They weren't all perfect, but she was very, very lovely about the ones that she liked, and she told me specifically what they were. And I wrote her back, and she wrote me back again, and eventually that spring she invited me to come to Bennington to give a reading, and I met her in person then. And from that minute on, we were very close. Throughout the first decade of the 2000s and into the teens, until she died in 2019, I visited her often in Provincetown, where much of her best work is set. And so I have a poem here I'd like to share that comes from Ice. It's an interesting poem because it's about my first visit. I don't remember how this happened, but I was driving into Provincetown from Washington, D.C. I'd driven up there to see her. Driving into Provincetown, and I suddenly realized I didn't have her address. Now, don't ask me how this happened. It was 2007 7, I want to say. So I don't remember how this happened, but I didn't have her address. And I was trying to remember what her address was. So going up and down Commercial Street, just, wildly thinking, I can't ghost Mary Oliver. So I saw a house with a nice even number, something like 100 Commercial Street, and I thought, I might as well try. So I parked the car, I walked up to 100 Commercial Street, knocked on the door, and someone answered, and I said, "Is this Mary Oliver's house?" And the person who answered said, "No, in fact, this is Stanley Kunitz's house," who is another famous poet who lived in Provincetown. So my lucky day, she happened to know where Mary lived, and she invited me in. Stanley Kunitz had just died at, I think, 102, and she invited me in, and she said, would you like to see Stanley's garden? And he, for those of you who are gardeners, he was a master gardener. And I said, yes, of course. And we went into this area in the back where the garden was still, blooming. And she said, Stanley's favorite flower was the hollyhock. And so she plucked one and gave it to me. And it was still a little unopened. And I put it in my pocket. And the poem is about that hollyhock in my pocket. This is called A Hollyhock That Once Belonged to Stanley Kunitz. Now, in the poem, I steal it, but I was given the hollyhock, just for my Buddhist friends out there. A hollyhock that once belonged to Stanley Kunitz. Later that week, I found it in my right side pocket. It had begun to bloom, blue, tissue thin. To the bottle of carbolic acid went your father. To brain plaque, the weed of forgetfulness, went your mother. Still you felt a fondness for the natural thing. You loved even the mulch and the flower of the mallow family hollyhock. Come in, you said. From one specimen of the garden, you cut me a sprig, which I pocketed. Taken from light, from you, from its princedom, small Gautama. Then I forgot it was there, down there in the dark, doing its precise work anyway. So I took the bloom out. I found the bloom in my pocket a couple of days later, and when I brought it out, it had already begun to open, even in the darkness. And this poem is special to me because it has to do with ice. It has to do with the bodies that we bury in a kind of forgetfulness, which I'm calling ice in this book, and how the light of attention melts that forgetfulness. And what is unearthed there are parts of ourselves that are still the same after all those decades, all those years, and also sort of ready to bloom, blooming along there without us. And that light comes, for me it was poetry that helped me to pay attention to what was in front of me, the isness of the things that were in front of me. And as I began to write poetry and as I began to read poetry, those frozen parts kind of rose to the surface like this hollyhock. So there's a lot of chthonic discoveries, going into the underworld and discovering something and bringing it back up to the surface in this book. Mary was a romantic poet who was born about 100 years too late. She loved what is mortal in the way that a romantic loves what's mortal. I spent a lot of time in Rome in the teen years of the 2000s. So 2015 and 16, I taught 2 summers in a row in Rome. And one of my favorite places to go was the Protestant cemetery just outside of the city, where if you died in Rome in the 19th century and you weren't a Catholic, this is where they took you. So does anybody know the famous buried people in this cemetery? Yeah. John Keats, yeah. Who said that? Yeah, John Keats. So an incredible grave in the Protestant cemetery. On the stone is something that he wanted written there in the last days of his life. He said, write this on the stone. It's something like, here lie the mortal remains of a young English poet whose name was writ on water. No name on the stone. And yet, if you go to that cemetery, my friend Jan Wagner, who's a German poet, if you go to that cemetery, we both had this experience, you'll always find somebody sitting in front of that grave. There's a little bench, and there's some watcher that's keeping vigil there. Every time I went, and I've gone many, many times. But it's the ultimate in the romantic sentiment. You know, here lie the mortal remains of a young English poet whose name was writ on water. There's a celebration of the impermanence in a romantic poet, which you see very much in Mary Oliver's work. That's one important thing. And in Keats, the great poem is To Autumn. The last stanza of To Autumn says to the season of autumn, the season of things dying at their height, like Keats was. If you know anything about his life, he was 25 and he was dying of tuberculosis, and he knew it. So autumn was him. He was autumn. So he's saying to autumn, where are the songs of spring? Where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. So his non-dual acceptance of death goes even further than just acceptance or surrender. It's as if to say, I want to find the beauty. I want to look so deeply into autumn and into dying that I find the music there, which is romanticism. There isn't that dualistic, like you get in neoclassical thinking, that dualistic, the light must fight against the dark, or life must fight against death. And romanticism, it's much more complicated and closer to how things really are, where we look at death and we look at what's necessary there, and we look at life and we proclaim what's necessary there. We think back to that poem that I read. She's always mixing the life and the death together, or she's turning the world into a body, the blue shoulders of the ponds. So a thing is never a thing itself. It's always its own opposite, too. So I'm just going to read one more poem of mine, and I want to leave a little time to answer any questions that you might have about Mary Oliver, or the time that I spent with her, or about her poetry. And I'm going to read one more of her poems for the group, one of my favorites. But this is a poem that I wrote for Mary, and it's here in this collection. It's called The Oar, and it's called that because one season in Provincetown, I was sitting on the couch, and there was a window overlooking the harbor, and we were sitting together having coffee or something, and she said, "You see that oar hanging over the table there?" And I said, "Oh yes, I've seen that oar for years." It was just a kind of messy thing that was chipping paint and falling apart, but it was beautiful to me. She said, "Well, I'm tired of that. I'm going to take that down, but do you want it?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. I'll take anything. I'll take a pebble. Anything that she gave me, I have in a shrine in my home." So I took that oar and I put it in my back seat, and it was, with me all the way back to Washington, D.C. But it represents something to me that's really powerful, and it has to do with poetry. Like, I don't think now that poetry is a destination. I don't think, in other words, that if you write poetry, it will turn you into a mystic or a better person. I don't even know if poetry is the boat that will take you and your practice, whatever it might be, or your own goodness, to mysticism and being a better person. But I do think that poetry is an oar. I think that poetry can guide you in rough waters to get to that other shore. So that's what this poem is about. It's about the oar that she gave me. The oar. It was what you gave me. Spattered with white paint on the flat end, stripped of its finish by the gunwale on the other. So I took it home that summer and stood it in the corner of my study. I wonder if it would be enough to carry me if my boat were lost on a river or the bay. I would be carried anyway, you might have said. You knew how waves carry little boats despite their plans. Things travel forward when there's nothing to impede them. Things travel forward also when there is, against the smack of the current, a voice, an oar to make a difference. So many stories begin with rage. Then you know it will be a long story. And when it's long, it will have to move slowly. I'm not making this up. It's just a fact, like it was for Achilles and Medea, or the way you talked about Tecumseh. You should have begun with rage, but instead you left it to your people. You lived a long time anyway. What do I call the force that propelled your work now that there's no mass to carry it? I'd call it wonder, but no, not that, not merely wide-eyed heartfulness. You bent down to things, hard-headed, squinting, wanting to see. I'm not amazed it's continued on without you. Another day, and I'm amazed that I'm still here, still writing things down. You were old and I was young when I met you. You said, while standing in the kitchen making coffee, the universe had to be, but it didn't have to be beautiful. The week you died, a deer in winter stepped out of the woods here, watching me watch her on the grass next to the road. It was dark. That was back in January. No headlights on the road. Nothing, at least in the way the world calls action, appeared to be happening. Thank you all for this part, the reading part. Does anyone have a question or a thought? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Debbie. I have a thought. I'm not really into poetry. Some poetry I am, like William Ernest Henley Invictus, things like that, and Where Are You Going, Braveheart, I can identify with that. But as you were reading Mary Oliver's first poem, the first thing that got my attention when you said, look, and then my eyes became like activated. And then you described the light, the pillars on the tree that enhance to see. And then you said something about the cinnamon. I began to taste, I can taste the cinnamon and smell the cinnamon, and then I can hear the waves of the water.
Yeah.
And as I said that, I was saying to myself, all my senses were involved. So that was my observation, and I just allowed myself to receive it, and that's what spoke to me.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a romantic moment, and by that I mean that, famously Plato claimed that the poet should be thrown out of the Republic because they rely on their senses, which are not consistent. Your sensuous experience of the world might be different from mine, and what we want is an agreed upon sense of reality. That's a classical point of view. The romantic point of view is the difference between your sensuous experience and mine is exactly what makes life interesting and spicy and wonderful. That it's the uniqueness of the person that is the expression of their genius, not the sameness of them. And so you really felt what she was trying to do, which was to turn on all of those different parts, seeing and hearing and smelling, especially smelling too, because you don't get that much in a poem. Mostly you get what I saw, but she is very engaged with all the senses. I agree.
I'm Elizabeth, and I'm a critical care chaplain, and I cite this line, and you probably know which Mary Oliver poem this is from, where she's describing her fear at an alligator, and I use this line, yes, and then I remember that death comes before the rolling away of the stone.
Yeah. I don't remember the alligator poem, but it's definitely, it's got her written all over it.
I have a question because you had a friendship with Mary Oliver, and I'm curious because so many of her poems talk about her relationship to nature and to places and to her pets, but I don't recall reading anything about her relationships with other people, and I wondered if you had any insight into that.
That is a very interesting point that you make, because that is what she lamented in the work of James Wright. She said this to me more than once, that James Wright was a poet of a previous generation, or similar generation. They were about 10 years apart, but she was the younger poet. And she noted in his work that very rarely were there people in the poems. And for her, solitude was definitely number one. So what you get is a solitary figure walking through the woods, or observing something, or even not even present in the poem, and just a description of, a clam, and what a clam does, and how a clam is different from me, and how a clam like me tries very hard not to die. So she is, I think, in her element when she's in solitude observing nature and its isness, as we're calling it tonight. But there are people in some of her poems. There is a poem about Pobiti, Georgia, where people appear, and that famous poem, Singapore, where she's in an airport and observing someone cleaning the bathroom in the airport. And in her later poems, in her last poems, there is often a figure that she's talking to. In her last book, Felicity, there's a recipient of the language in a way that it doesn't appear in the earlier pieces. I really feel like in the earlier pieces, if you know the book Thirst that I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, in the earlier pieces, a lot of the poems are just addressed to God, but the later poems are addressed to an other, a beloved. So that would be a presence of a person. But I think you're right. I think that she is in her best element when she's in solitude, walking through nature among the nameless things, and feeling the metaphorical and symbolic connection to the world. Oh, here's someone up front.
Thank you for your sharing. And I'm reminded of how powerful poetry is. Sometimes I think I'm almost afraid of how powerful it is, because it can really take us deep. And I just randomly remembered someone told me that in Poland, in the cemetery, there's a place where all the poets who are the most honored people of all are buried. Have you heard that? And do you?
I don't know that place. It sounds like Krakow, but but I don't know that place.
I don't know, or if it was just in Poland in general.
Why do you suppose?
The point being that the poets are so honored because they are able to touch us in some way. And it just, hearing you talk about Mary Oliver, who I really love, I just feel like it's a reminder of how powerful poetry is.
You know what it is? I know these places all around the world, not just in Poland, but in England and other places that I've visited where poets are honored. The Taj Mahal, all the poetry at the Taj Mahal is written in Farsi, which is kind of the language of poetry of Iran and Afghanistan. So it's strange to find it there, but it's as if poetry is speaking the language of God. And one little story about how a poet gets there. How do you learn the language of God? There's no Berlitz course on the language of God. I was at Mary's place once, and it was early morning, 5:30 in the morning. I'd gotten up to observe her working at the typewriter, and we were having a cup of coffee together in the kitchen, which, I would give anything for now. But there was a package on the coffee table that had come from Alaska, and it was opened and empty. And I said, "Oh, Mary, you got a package from Kodiak Island." And she said, "Oh, yes, my friend Tom Dancer sent me that package from Kodiak Island." And I said, "Well, what was in it?" And she said, "Inside the package was a tiny white pine cone." And I said, "Well, that of all the things to send, that's very interesting." She said, "Oh, but he found it in a pile of bear scat on Kodiak Island." And I said, "Wow!" So Tom Dancer saw that little pine cone and saw Dante going through the inferno, and coming out the other side. And she laughed and she said, "Yes, exactly. That's why I ate the pine cone." Can you imagine? She ate the pine cone. And I use this now all the time. I ate the pine cone. But what does it mean? It means that for a poet to merely wrap words around a thing is not enough. That for a poet like her, and when I say a poet, I'm just not talking about people scribes, that they're describing things and writing down words. I'm talking about a way of life. I'm talking about an experience of the holy. And for a poet, it's not enough to just wrap a word around it. You want to be it. You have to eat the pine cone. And that pine cone, was a host. That pine cone was metaphorically anything that we take into ourselves which connects us with the unnameable. So that's the Berlitz School of Poetry. When you get there, you can't help but write it down. You want to translate it back into the language of the everyday, so that other people can have this. She spent a lot of time in her youth, after leaving the house, traveling around and trying to find her way in the world. And for a brief period, she actually lived in the woods in Ohio when she left home. And I think that period for her was like a communion with nature, whose stakes were very high. It wasn't just, let's go saunter in the woods. For her, it was a matter of life and death. Anybody else? Yes.
Did Mary ever talk to you about her feelings about Emily Dickinson and her attention to tiny things?
Interestingly enough, Mary was more obsessed with Walt Whitman and Walt Whitman's big expressions of expansion and oneness. She was probably most influenced by Whitman of any poet, and Rumi later, but mostly Whitman in her early years. And you can really see the connection. There's a Whitman poem called "When I Heard the Learned Astronomer," where he's in this poem? Yeah. So for everybody else, the speaker is in a big hall, and an astronomer is explaining the stars and naming all the stars. And Whitman writes something like, "How soon I became tired and sick and went out in perfect silence and stood under the stars." So that's what's going on here. That I'm tired of the names of things. I'd rather go out and stand in perfect silence in the woods or by the waters. But Emily Dickinson is my poet, so I can answer your question because Emily Dickinson is my number one poet, and I even have a poem about her house in this book. And for me, what makes Dickinson, interesting, is she's the opposite of Whitman. She's a poet who whispers, and even Whitman's lines that just go out and out and out like this, Dickinson's lines, if you look at them on the page, have these dashes, and they kind of go in and in and in. And they're so full of hesitation. It's like she's saying, I don't know anything about what's true. And Whitman is saying, I know everything is about what's true. And in the end, they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying it's all of the same truth, and there's no name for it. But Whitman calls it Walt Whitman. But it's the same. But I love her the best. I love the whispering, quiet poet, Emily Dickinson, best of all.
I really appreciate this. I'm very new to poetry, and I've been enthralled with reading Mary's. And one of my favorites is When I Am Among the Trees. If you don't know it, it's very short.
Please,
I'll read it quickly. It says, when I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locusts, equally the beech, the oaks, and the pines, they get off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily. I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me, the trees stir in their leaves and call out, stay a while. The light flows from their branches, and they call again. It's simple, they say. You too have come into the world to do this, to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. I read that centering prayer.
You notice at the end of that poem, she's doing the same thing that she's doing in Blackwater Woods, which is to say, here are 3 things that you can take away: to go easy, to be filled with light, and to shine. Yeah. Any other questions? That is underway right now. There's a wonderful writer who was an editor at Penguin who took this on, and she's doing an amazing job of it, because think about it, there's nothing out there. I mean, we know very little about Mary, and she gave very few interviews. She gave a lot of public readings, but she didn't reveal a lot about her life in her poems. So Lindsay's job is difficult. But she found many, many letters, and I'll just say one more incredibly moving thing that I still can't get over. But it was 4 years after Mary had died that Lindsay, who I knew through another friend from another connection already, got in touch with me, and she said that she had some questions about my relationship with Mary and wondered if I could talk to her for a while. And we met at Politics and Prose down in D.C. And I thought I would tell her some of the stories that I told you all tonight, and that would be everything. But Lindsay pulled out of her bag a file, like a folder of letters that I had written Mary and that Mary had written back to me, that Mary had kept a file of our correspondence. And believe me when I say, there was nothing keepable on my side of what was sent in those letters. I mean it. There was nothing. I was writing in a notebook and just, here are my thoughts today, great poet of the universe. And I sent these to her, and she kept them. And I never knew it. She kept all kinds of things. She kept a letter of reference that I never knew she wrote for me. And this is how I started tonight, and it's how I want to close. It's just that she was the person that is reflected in her poems. That she was not a person without flaws. In fact, that in the romantic tradition, that's what makes her lovable. That's what makes her absolutely wonderful. That she preferred to be alone, and that there were things about her daily life we'll never know because she wanted to be private about them. There are all kinds of locked doors when we try to access the whole story of Mary Oliver. But that actually brightens the light in her work, because she's sort of telling us even now to go back to the poems. If you want to find anything out about what's going on in there, go back to the poems, and I think I've given you everything. But she was a person like no one I had ever known, and no one I'll ever know again. Can I just read one more poem for you all? This is a poem that first appeared in the New Yorker, and just to hear it, it's a very plain spoken poem, but it has such a deep message at the end. It's called Lead, and it's about the lead lures that the loons had been eating, and as a result dying of lead poisoning on the beach in Provincetown. Here's a story to break your heart. Are you willing? This winter, the loons came to our harbor and died, one by one, of nothing we could see. A friend told me of one on the shore that lifted its head and opened the elegant beak and cried out in the long, sweet savoring of its life, which, if you have heard it, you know is a sacred thing, and for which, if you have not heard it, you had better hurry to where they still sing. And believe me, tell no one just where that is. The next morning, this loon, speckled and iridescent and with a plan to fly home to some hidden lake, was dead on the shore. I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. So what this poet wants of us is, it's a big ask. The ask is that we open our hearts and make them vulnerable to a wound. The wound is in feeling the suffering of not just others around us who look like us and act like us, but beings who are suffering as well, just under our noses. And when we open ourselves to that wound, to never close the heart again, that's the biggest part of the ask. By opening the heart, though, this lead that's in the title, I can't help but thinking of alchemy in this poem, that this lead in the title is about turning that into gold in the forge of the heart. That by letting in all of this suffering, there is a way that we can transform it through compassion, through attention, through just noticing what others are going through. So this poem has become for me one of the central poems of her career, and its message couldn't be simpler. When you feel that opening happen, as it comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes, but when you feel that opening happen, try not to close. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, David.